Howdy. I learned something this morning. So you guys are looking well given last night's activities. That's good. So how many people love math? Thank you for humoring me. That was about 37% of the room. So I'm Sunil Sharma. I'm the CEO of InferSystems, and InferSystems provides a layer of math that sits on top of existing platforms and enhances advertising effectiveness. That's what we do. But that's not what I want to talk to you about. We're a team of mathematicians and scientists, so I want to talk to you about math, the history of math. And the reason I want to talk to you about that is I think we learn a lot from the history of math. We learn not so much about math, but human nature, and I think we learn lessons that apply to this market, some of the challenges that we face, and how I think we can overcome our own egos to continue to innovate. So the first thing is, where does math come from? Where does advanced math come from? Actually, this has been lost in the history of the world, and it's re-emerging. Most of the advanced math that we know of comes from India at least 6,000 years ago in terms of written form, and inferentially, scientists believe that 10 or 12,000 years ago at least they were practicing advanced math like what the Google search algorithm is built on, number theory, and of course our favorite, the Pythagorean theorem. So, but the problem is, I'm not going to talk to you about the Indians because the Indians were boring. You know, they had self-realization, they had spirituality, they had all this stuff, but I'm going to talk to you about the Greeks because the Greeks made math fun. And specifically, it was the Pythagoreans. So the Pythagoreans were actually a group. So Pythagoras had a posse, and they were not only mathematicians, but they loved to party. They used to take lots of cruises on the Mediterranean, and this is the G-rated version of what they did. So, but the other thing, the Pythagoreans were more than that. Pythagoreans were not just mathematicians, they were just not party animals, but they were actually a religious cult. So the Pythagoreans believed two fundamental things about existence and God that applies to our market and to this discussion. One, they believed that God exists, and two, they believed that God would not create a universe with irrational numbers or fractions. God does not like fractions. Fractions go to hell. So until one day a guy named Hippasus came along. Hippasus was a Pythagorean, and he was on board one of these, booze cruises, and he does his mathematical equations in the corner, and he comes up and he says, hey, by the way, here's mathematical proof fractions do exist, irrational numbers exist. So he literally, for the Western world, created a new branch of mathematics from which, of course, we can imagine so many things could be done, because if you have subsets of numbers which are infinite, you can do so many things with science. So what was his reward? They killed him. They literally threw him overboard into the Mediterranean, and the legend is that Pythagoras himself did this. So I think there is a lesson. Ad tech isn't this extreme, but I think for some of us who like to innovate, there is that sort of pushback, and I think we've seen this in our careers throughout, whatever organizations we worked in, life or whatever. I think there's that sort of pushback. So what do we learn about human nature from this? A couple of things. One, nobody likes to know it all. So that's the only thing I'm nervous about while I'm up here is. I'll be quick. The second thing is ego. Ego is the thing that drives the decisions we make. It's not our knowledge, it's not our experience, it's not what information is being provided. It's how do we feel egotistically about that. We all have egos that we couldn't exist otherwise, and they're equal, they just manifest differently. So, and I've been in that position. I'm an academic, math and economics, and I think personally I try to correct myself whenever I feel like I've come up with a new equation or a new way of looking at economics and someone wants to challenge it. You have to consciously check yourself and say, wait a minute, maybe I should actually listen to this perspective, because together we can then innovate and go to the next level. But there is that internal human nature thing, which is once we toil to discover something, we want to defend that position, and it becomes the defense that becomes the most important thing. So another example of this is the 80-20 rule. How many people have heard of the 80-20 rule? How many people think it's true? It's a trick question. So the 80-20 rule is often used to say, well, 80% of marketing spend, or 20% of the customers will buy 80% of the products, or 20% of the customers will be 80% of your profit, whatever it is. Or another example where the 80-20 rule is used is when you explain something complex and there's one person who doesn't get it in the room, and they'll be like, so it's like the 80-20 rule, right? You always get that. Well, it doesn't exist, because what happened with the 80-20 rule, the history here is Wilfredo Pareto, who is one of the greatest economists of all time, in 1906 came up with this thing called the Pareto principle, where he studied the wealth distribution of nations. And he figured out that 80% of the wealth was controlled by 20% of the people in all nations, so it became a law, a rule. The issue was that he studied only European nations at the time who had similar economic structures, similar sensibilities, similar politics, similar lifestyles, whatever it was. But the issue there is, the truth there is that the truth itself what was actually occurring didn't lie in his conclusion, but rather in the conditions. In that the conditions that occurred, which were similar across all nations, were creating this 80-20 rule. And as conditions began to change and the world began to evolve, the 80-20 rule became debunked. So there is no 80-20 rule. So quit using it. So what this teaches us, I think, is that one, data tells us nothing. Data never tells us anything. We infer from data. If I didn't have the benefit of knowing that Christopher Columbus sailed around the world, I would look around and think the world is flat with the same amount of intelligence that I have now. It's perspective. It's how you use the data. So our 80-20 rule in ad tech is 20% of the companies are innovating and the 80% want to throw them overboard. But there is this dark cloud that I think hangs over ad tech. I think those of us who have been in this for a few years, who have been trying to innovate, there is now this mentality of we can do everything the best. We have the best managed service, the best algorithm, best this, best that. And it's that initial sort of egotistical thing that we all suffer from, which is once we create the first level of innovation, we want to defend that level of innovation against everything else. So we are an optimization company, and specifically in terms of what InferSystems is doing, what we're observing, I can confidently say that in most of the cases, very often less than 1% of the data is actually being used to drive real effectiveness by the buyers. You hear all this different stuff about different types of data, but at the end of the day, how is it being ingested? How are the signals being extracted, and what is it doing? So that creates a number of risks and opportunities, but the risks are frankly greater than the opportunities. If you're a buyer or a seller, what this means to you is that if most of your data, regardless of how it's being formatted, what it's being called, what segment category it's being put in, if it's not really being used for advertising effectiveness, you don't have yield, you don't have scale, you don't have advertising performance, and you have a commodity because your data is going wasted. That's the only place where there really is sustainable value. So I think, and a number of publishers and advertisers, I think they're starting to do this, but by and large, what we see in the market is there's still a hands-off mentality that we see the numbers working, we have these partners, things are good. I think a number of us have talked, and there have been a number of presenters who have talked about the fact that just because things are good doesn't mean they're going to be good, especially in the RTB market, we have 60, 70% growth per year. So the solution is you've got to pull up your sleeves, you've got to not only know what's working, but why it's working. What's the logic behind it? And what's going to happen when the conditions change? And if you're an intermediary like we are, DSPs, SSPs, networks, exchanges, first mover advantage and incumbency means nothing in a fast growth market in which we're in chapter 1 of the book. We're in the prologue. So you can do that. You can have the mentality of, well, we're going to do everything under one roof and we're the market leader and you can't leapfrog us. Well, no, there's leapfrogging that's going to happen. So there's an opportunity and a threat. But I think as an intermediary now, and as a former agency trading desk guy, I've sort of been on both sides of this, I think for people like us who are sort of in the middle space, the innovators, if you will, that mentality of we're going to do everything in-house, I think doesn't work. And the second thing is I think this is very difficult from a management perspective. I'm lucky because I've got a team of scientists and engineers and mathematicians, and they know I would not give them this compliment if it were not true, who actually are open to, hey, there's a company here that's innovating. Let's go talk to them and let's figure out how we can work with them and then use that human interaction to develop things together. Not a lot of that happening, and I think as a manager, you have to take risks because at the end of the day, you can't just say, well, our engineers have taken us to level 1, and so now we're just going to not go to level 10. Even though I was bombarded by 1,000+ vendors in the agency, at some point you've got to make those 5 decisions, say we're going to invest here and take this thing to the next level. So I think what we're getting to is the fact that no one could do everything by themselves, and I'll just leave you with a couple of things. One, don't be that guy. Don't put your head in the sand or wherever else it might fit. Even though we're in Laguna Beach and we've got beautiful beaches here, there's only one thing that can happen to you if you're in that position. Be a lion. Be a lion. But the thing about lions is they live in prides, and they work together, and they collaborate. And I think that's the story here. I think that's been the story of the last 3 years, and I think it's going to continue to be the story even more, particularly as big data, as we call it, is coming in and new mathematical systems are evolving and so forth. It's really about finding who does what best. And when you look at that Luma slide, which we all say is messy and it creates all this chaos, well, within that is also opportunity. So that's what I'll leave you with, and thank you very much.